In the fourth chapter of the Megillah, in Perek Daled, we read of a particularly vulnerable and dramatic moment in the story of Purim. It's a conversation that the Torah describes in great detail between Mordechai and Esther. Albeit there's a messenger that's going back and forth between them. The Megillah says Mordechai is in torn clothing and he's not allowed to enter the gates of the king as long as he's wearing a levush sak, as long as he's wearing sackcloth. A messenger is going back and forth between Mordechai and Esther, but the Torah describes to us in great length the nature of the conversation between them, and of course you all know it because it's very famous. Mordechai insists that Esther go before the king. Lischanen loy, to plead before him, levakesh milefonov al amo, to seek, to do her best to attempt to save her people, the Jewish people who've been sentenced to death by a decree of Haman, signed with the signet ring of Achashverosh. Mordechai wants her to go immediately. Mordechai wants her to reveal her identity that she's kept hidden from her husband Achashverosh for years. Mordechai wants her to go and do it now. Esther initially thinks this is not a good idea. She says, everybody knows, Kol Avdei HaMelech, all the servants of the king, V'Amadinois HaMelech, and all the citizens of the country of the king, everybody knows that any man or woman that shows up in the internal chamber of the king without being summoned is immediately put to death. If I go there, she says, I'm no different, Esther says, if I show up uninvited, I'll be killed. In fact, Esther says, I haven't been summoned for 30 days. So there's a good chance that if I just wait a couple of more days, the king will call me because we haven't seen each other in 30 days. So why don't I just wait instead of going and risking my life just by showing up before I let one word out of my mouth? Esther says, I can be executed, Rahman al-Islam. Why the rush? Mordechai doubles down. Mordechai tells her, don't think you yourself are going to be saved, right? Don't think you yourself are going to be able to escape in the palace of the king. Mordechai tells her those famous words, Revach v'hatzolo yamoid laYehudim mimokem acher. The Jews will be saved no matter what. If you don't go now, you will be lost. Your father's house will be lost. This is the reason why you became queen in the first place. Actually, Mordechai says, who knows? Mi yodeya, right? If this is the reason why you became queen in the first place. He insists that she go immediately. Esther agrees. But she has one final request. She tells Mordechai, please gather together all the Jews of Shushan and fast for me for 3 days, Laila v'yoim, night and day. Esther says, me and my maidservants will also fast for these 3 days. And with that, I agree to go to the king. Mordechai agrees, and he does exactly as Esther had requested. He has the Jews of Shushan fast for 3 days and 3 nights. Esther agrees after she fasts for 3 days and 3 nights with her maidservant. She goes to the king, and of course you all know the story from there. Vayhi b'yom hashlishi, the Possuk says, the beginning of the 5th chapter of the Megillah, Esther goes to the queen, and instead of being executed miraculously, the king extends his golden scepter and welcomes her, and so it goes. Esther invites them to a party. Okay, so again, let's review the stages of the conversation. Mordechai tells her to go. Esther says, bad idea, I'm risking my life. Mordechai says the Jews are going to be saved anyways. If you don't go now, you and your father's house will be lost. Esther says, I agree on the condition that the Jews of Shushan fast for 3 days and 3 nights. I'll fast as well, and then I'll go to the king. Mordechai agrees and institutes and initiates the fast. Esther agrees, she fasts as well, and then she goes to the king, and Baruch Hashem, she is not executed. Instead, the king welcomes her, and the story goes on from there. Okay. While there are, I don't think it would be an exaggeration to say, tens, hundreds of details in the conversation that need to be understood, even in the structure of the conversation, right? How they're responding to each other. I want to focus for now on a couple of ideas that are shared in the Midrash, giving us more details specifically with regard to the conversation between the two. Okay. First of all, Mordechai, according to the Midrash, makes it absolutely clear to Esther that the Jews do not need her to save them. Quote, Ma atzvura, says Mordechai to Esther. What do you think? Shakadosh Baruch Hu maniach es Yisrael, that Almighty God is going to abandon the Jews? You think Hashem's not going to help them? Mikol makoy ma'amid lahem goyel. No matter what, Mordechai says to her, whether you go or whether you don't go to Achashverosh, either way, Hakadosh Baruch Hu, the Rebbeinu Shalom, is going to send them a redeemer. As the Possuk indicates, says the Midrash, Revach v'hatzolo yamoid la Yehudim mimokam acher. If it won't be through you, it'll be from somewhere else. Make no mistake, says Mordechai. If you don't go, Hashem will choose someone else to save them. Okay? Esther says, if that's the case, she agrees to go, but she wants the Jews to fast for 3 days. Ve'eluhein, the Jews in Shushan, to fast for 3 days. Eluhein, says the Midrash. Which 3 days did the Jewish people fast? Does Esther want the Jewish people to fast? Yud Gimel, Yudaled v'Tesvav b'Nisan, the 13th, 14th, and 15th day of Nisan. Remember, Haman's decree is released on the 13th day of Nisan. So Esther wants the Jews to fast immediately, 13, 14, and 15 of Nisan. Okay. Says the Midrash, listen very carefully, Sholach lo. There's a part to the conversation that is not recorded in the actual Psukim. Mordechai sends a message to Achashverosh. Mordechai sends a message, to Esther. How can you ask us to fast on the 13th, 14th, and 15th day of Nisan? Varei bohem yoim rishon shel Pesach. The 15th day of Nisan is Pesach. The 15th day of Nisan is Pesach. How can you ask a Jew to fast on Pesach? First of all, there's a biblical mitzvah of matzah. Second of all, there's a mitzvah of morar. Thirdly, there's the 4 cups of wine. And Bechlal, which Jewish family isn't standing in the kitchen and cooking for weeks and months before Pesach, Ichveis, all of the Pesach foods? You want us to fast on Pesach? Says Mordechai, what are you saying? Varei bohem yom rishon shel Pesach, says Mordechai to Esther. The 3 days that you're talking about include the first day of Pesach. Amrullah, Esther responds. Again, another part of the conversation, not articulated by the Possuk, but the Midrash articulates it. Amrullah, so Esther sends the message back to Mordechai, quote, Zokein shebi Yisrael. Zokein shebi Yisrael. Sage of Israel, old man of Israel. Again, Mordechai is in his 90s, old man of Israel. Lomahu Pesach. Why do the Jews celebrate Pesach? That was the message. Lomahu Pesach. Why do the Jews celebrate Pesach? End of quote. Miyad Shoma Mordechai. Immediately when Mordechai heard this, and Mordechai admitted that she was right. And Mordechai instituted and instigated the fast for 3 days on the 13th, 14th, and 15th of Nisan. Hado d'chsiv, this is the meaning of the Possuk, concludes the Midrash. Vayaver Mordechai. Simply it means, this is the last Possuk of Perek Dalet. Vayaver Mordechai. Vayas k'chol asher tzivso lo Esther. Simply the Possuk means that Mordechai went and did what Esther told him. Says the Midrash, the Gemara also brings this. Vayaver Mordechai in Eretz Yisrael, they translated Hamonam Shehever. Vayaver means he transgressed. Shehever Yom Tov Pesach Betainis. Mordechai transgressed together with all the Jews of Shushan. They transgressed all the mitzvahs of Pesach that year, and instead of eating matzah and moror and drinking 4 cups of wine and having a seder with charoises and karpas and alla good zachen and eggs dipped in salt water, instead they fasted. Vayaver Mordechai, the Midrash teaches, Mordechai transgressed. Based on what Esther had told him, they fasted the 13th, 14th, and 15th of Nisan, and Esther did too. Until after the 3rd day, she went to the king. Okay. What exactly was this argument that Esther said that convinced Mordechai to transgress all of these mitzvahs of Pesach and fast? The words the Midrash gives us is, Lomahu Pesach, why do we celebrate Pesach? So what's that got to do with it? So here the commentaries give a very simple, a very straightforward and very clear explanation of what Esther meant. I'm quoting here from the Eitz Yosef, the commentary on the Midrash. Koloimar says the Eitz Yosef, what does it mean? Leminit stava, Esther said. Lamahu Pesach, lama, in other words, as if it would say, lamiu Pesach. To whom is the mitzvah of Pesach? Rak Yisrael, only Jews. Goyim are not commanded to observe Pesach. to observe Pesach, right? They don't have to do B'dikas Chametz and Mechiras Chametz and Bittul Chametz and all the rest of it. It's just the Jews who are obligated to do this. And if, God forbid, the Jewish people are exterminated, annihilated, sentenced to death, all of them massacred as sentenced in Haman's decree, Pesach matehei olav, what's going to be with Pesach anyway, says Esther. Lachein, therefore, mutav sheyechalalu Pesach echad, kedei lakayim psachim harbe. Better, says Esther to Mordechai, that the Jews should desecrate and violate one Pesach this year, not eat matzah, not eat more, not do all of the mitzvahs involved with eating and drinking, so that we fast for 3 days, so that we will be saved. So that once the Jewish people are saved, then for all future generations, for thousands of years, they'll be able to keep Pesach after this. But if we don't desecrate the Pesach now, says Esther, if we don't fast now, if we don't go to the king now, we'll be exterminated, and then nothing will be left with Pesach at all. This is the way the commentaries explain Esther's argument. Again, she says, Lomo Pesach, what's the whole purpose of Pesach? Who's commanded in the mitzvah of Pesach? The Jews. No, if we don't save the Jews, then there'll anyways be no more Pesach. So what are you, Mordechai, concerned about? How can we violate the Yom Tov of Pesach? Esther says, if we don't violate the Yom Tov of Pesach and the Jews no longer exist, then for sure the Yom Tov of Pesach is violated because there'll be nobody there to observe it. The Goyim are not obligated to keep Pesach. Miyad, says the Midrash, Shama Mordechai hears this. He admits, he says, you're right, and he goes, and all the Jews in Shushan fast. Vayavar Mordechai, and that they transgress. They violate the Yom Tov of Pesach that year in order to be able to fast for Esther to go to, for the success for Esther to go to Achashverosh. Okay. I got 5 questions. Question number 1, which I think is the most obvious of them all, there seems to be an open and obvious contradiction between these two comments of the Midrash, literally within 3 lines of each other. First, Mordechai says to her, quote, Revach v'hatzola yamad laYehudim mimokem acher. The fate of the Jews is not at stake here. The Jews will be saved no matter what. In fact, he even says to her, quote, Ma'atzvur, what do you think? HaKadosh Baruch Hu, you think God is going to abandon the Jews? If not, Mordechai says to her, if not you, somebody else will redeem the Jews. If you don't go, you'll be lost. If you don't go now to save the Jews, you and your father's house will be lost. The Jews will be fine. Okay, granted. So the Jews will be saved either way. Next sentence, Esther says, but we have to fast. And we have to fast on Pesach. How can you fast on Pesach? Answer, if we don't fast on Pesach, the Jewish people will no longer exist, and then Pesach will be meaningless. Now I'm confused. But you just told me that the fate of the Jews is not at stake here at all. So the Jews are anyways going to be saved. So if the Jews are anyways going to be saved, then they can observe the Yom Tov of Pesach for all future generations. It's not the Jewish people's future that's in question here. It's only Esther, the Atubeis Avich, that's being challenged here. So what's Esther saying? Lomahu Pesach, if we don't violate Pesach now, there'll be no Jews to keep Pesach in the future. Why not? And why does Mordechai accept what she's saying? When Mordechai was just the one who told her that the fate of the Jews is secure. The whole thing doesn't make sense. If the fate of the Jews is secure, then the fate of Pesach is secure. And if the fate of the Jews is not secure, and therefore the fate of Pesach is not secure, then why does Mordechai tell Hashem is going to save the Jews anyways? Seems to be an open contradiction from one line to the next. Next, question number 2. Mordechai comes to Esther, again, sends a message, tells Esther, you have to go to the king now. Esther says, it doesn't make any sense for me to go now. If I go now, I risk my life. Let's wait a couple of days until the king calls me. How long could it be? It's already, she says, 30 days I wasn't called. How long could it be? Mordechai says, no, you must go now. Esther says, okay. But first, everybody has to fast for 3 days. Again, confusing. What? Mordechai just said you have to go now. No, and she agrees. She's not going to wait for Achashverosh to call her, okay? Because it's so urgent that she go now that she's not going to wait. But everybody has to fast for 3 days first. Esther says, me too. What? Why? Granted, you can say before any Yid does something, they have to fast and daven to the Eibishter, that it should be successful. Okay, Nusa fast for 1 day, fast for half a day, go daven mincha. And then, if it's so important to Rush that Mordechai is ready to throw Esther to the lions, into the lion's den over this, risk her life, no? So why do we need a... So why do they both readily agree? Why does Mordechai readily agree to Esther's proposal? Let's wait for 3 days. If it's urgent, then it's urgent. Next, question 3. When Mordechai asks her, how can we fast on Pesach? She says, Zoken shebi Yisrael lomohu Pesach. Why does she need to refer to him as Zoken shebi Yisrael? It's almost... when you read it first, it almost sounds a little derogatory, like, hey, old Jewish man, why do we celebrate Pesach in the first place? Why does she need to refer to him as Zoken Sheb Yisrael? Why does she need to ask him, Lomohu Pesach? What kind of a way is that to express the fact that, apparently in her opinion, the fate of the Jews, for whatever reason, is in danger? Difficult to understand. And then finally, I think the most difficult part to understand is the Midrash concludes... Midrash says, Miyad Shama Mordechai. Mordechai immediately heard, admitted to what she said, and went and implemented it. What did he hear? What is he admitting to? What did she say? Either way, this is difficult to understand. If Mordechai thinks the fate of the Jews is at stake, the Jews are in danger, then why before did he say that they're not? And if Mordechai thinks the fate of the Jews is not in danger, then why is he agreeing to Esther's words when Esther says, if we don't do something now, the Jews will cease to exist? And most importantly, if the fate of the Jews is at stake, so what great chiddush did Esther say here? We should violate Pesach to save the life of the Jews. Otherwise, in the future, there'll be nobody to observe Pesach. This is a very obvious, well-known concept. Pikuach nefoshes is doicha kol ha'torah kula, except for avodah zorah gil arais at shvichas damim. You have to be machal Shabbos to save a life. You have to be machal Yom Tov, of course. No? So if the whole Jewish nation is in danger, obviously you're Machalal Yom Tov to go and save. If this is what it takes to be Machalal, to save a Jewish life, to Machalal Shabbos Yom Tov, of course, everybody knows this. In fact, if you hesitate, the halacha has terrible things to say about somebody who would, God forbid, hesitate to desecrate the Shabbos when a person's life is when a Jew's life is at stake, even potentially, possibly at stake. What does it say? The Jewish future is at stake. We have to desecrate Pesach. Oh, Mordechai, here's what she says. Miyad Shama v'hoidl, some chiddush. The whole thing doesn't make sense. In Mordechai's opinion, the Jewish people will be saved anyways, so there's no problem. In Esther's opinion, apparently, the Jewish people are in danger, so therefore there is a problem. But again, if there is a problem, then why is it such a fantastic chiddush to go and be machal, some fantastic novelty to go and desecrate the Yom Tov of Pesach? Of course, to desecrate the Yom Tov of Pesach, you have to desecrate the Yom Tov of Pesach and Shavuos and Sukkot and Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur and Tu B'Shvat and Lag B'Omer, everything combined, to save the life of even one Jew. How much more so for the sake of all of the Jews? All right, all of this needs to be understood. I want to introduce another Midrash. As I like to say in our shul when we study these Midrashim together, I'm going to study with you a Midrash now that I believe it is not genuinely. I believe it is genuinely not an exaggeration to say that this is one of the most enigmatic, difficult to understand, even I would say downright profoundly disturbing Midrashim that we'll ever study together. Okay. This Midrash is on the first Possuk of Perek Hey of Megillat Esther. Vayhi bayom hashlishi vatilbash Esther malchus, and the third day, in other words, the third day of her fast, after she fasted for 3 days, Esther puts on royal garments and she goes to the king. And of course, the king receives her and says, you can have whatever you want, ad chatzia malchus, and Esther says, all I want is to invite you to a party. Okay. Listen to me very carefully. Midrash Rabba, Esther, Parsha Tes, Perek Beis. Dovar acher vayhi bayom hashlishi. Another interpretation on the words vayhi bayom hashlishi was on the third day of her fast that Esther went to the king. Says the Midrash, quote, La'olam ein Yisrael nesunin batzara yoiser megimel yomim. The Jewish people The Jewish people are never placed in a distressful situation for more than 3 days. La'olam ein Yisrael. Listen to the words. La'olam ein Yisrael nesunin batzara yoser megimel yomim. The Rabbeinu Shalom never places the Jews in a stressful or difficult situation more than 3 days. 5 proofs. Number 1, Avraham Avinu on the way to the Akedah. See if the Possuk says, Bayoim Ashlishi was on the 3rd day, Vayisa Avraham Esainov. Avram lifted his eyes and he saw the place where he was supposed to take Yitzchak to the Akedah. So you see, 3 days, Avraham Avinu arrived where he had to go. Number 2, with regard to the Shvatim, Yosef is accusing them of being spies. Yosef is accusing his own brothers of being spies. He recognizes them, they don't recognize him. The simple meaning is, he knows who they are, they don't know who he is. Yosef makes all sorts of accusations, and he incarcerates them, he places them in prison. How long? How long does he imprison them for? And he locks them up. He puts them in prison, shloishes yomim, for 3 days, and then he released them. Proof number 3, Yoina Hanavi running away from carrying out Hashem's mission, to go to Nineveh and tell the people to repent. He's swallowed by a fish. How long is Yoina in the belly of the fish? 3 days and 3 nights. Again, you see, no more than 3 days. Proof number 4, when Mashiach comes, please God, speedily in our days, and the dead will be brought back to life, before their fate is sealed that they will live, please God, eternally, they have to go through some form of a judgment. How long till the Rabbeinu Shalom rules that they can live forever? 3 days, as the Possuk says. The 3rd day, the Rabbeinu Shalom will set them up and then they'll live forever. Again, you see, no more than 3 days. And finally, when it comes to the Megillat Esther, the Gam Hanes Hazeh, this miracle of saving the Jews, happens at the end of 3 days of fasting. As the Possuk says, after 3 days, Esther puts on royal garments, she goes before the king, and the king welcomes her, Baruch Hashem, and things are good from there. So here you see, says the Midrash, again, La'olam ein Yisrael nesunim batzara yoser megimel yomim. Okay. Every part of this Midrash requires understanding. First, let's start with the obvious. Is the Midrash really saying that Jews never suffer for more than 3 days? How are we going to forgive the Midrash for saying that? We're 2,000 years in Golus. The Jews have been suffering for close to 2,000 years. That's not more than 3 days. Megillat Esther, the very story of Purim. The Jews have a death sentence over their head for 11 months. A threat of annihilation, extermination, and complete genocide for 11 months. The Holocaust, the Crusades, Spanish Inquisition, the bloodbath of Jewish history. October 7th, Rahman al-Islam. No Jew ever suffers for more than 3. You never had a toothache for more than 3 days? Rahman al-Islam, we all know people who suffer for years with all sorts of physical illnesses, mental health illness. May Hashem protect us. How does the Midrash have the gall to say no Jew ever suffers for more than 3 days? Question number 1. The Midrash brings 4 or 5 proofs. Let's go through the proofs. Number 1, Avraham Avinu on the 3rd day lifted up his eyes and knew where he had to go in the Akedah. I don't understand what the Midrash means. When Avraham Avinu lifted up his eyes on the 3rd day and he saw the place, his suffering ended. Which Bechlal suffering are we talking about? The assumption here is we're talking about the suffering that Avraham Avinu thinks he has to sacrifice his son. This Possuk is taken from the Akedah. No. So when he gets there on the 3rd day and he raises up his eyes, Vayisa Avraham Esainov, and he sees the place, now his suffering is over? now his suffering is increased. Now he's got to take his son to the top of this place which he's just located. Avram Avinu thinks he's got to shecht him. Does the Midrash mean that Avram's suffering is over when Hashem tells him not to shecht his son? But that's not what the Midrash quotes. The Midrash quotes, as soon as Avram Avinu lifts his eyes and sees the place, his suffering is over. It's getting worse. This is becoming worse. So now that Avram Avinu finally finds the place where to shecht his son, now the Midrash says he's no longer suffering. Next example. Hashvatim, says the Midrash. The Shvatim, the brothers, Yosef locked them up for 3 days. Okay, granted. Yosef locked them up for 3 days. The brothers didn't know what was going on. But what's the truth? The truth is that it was Yosef. The truth is that they weren't in danger at all. Not for 1 minute. The truth is they were in the hands of a loving brother who was just trying to facilitate, a path of tshuva for them. This is an example of where we see because Yosef locked them up for 3 days. Again, the reality here is that they're not in sorrow for even 1 second because they're in the hands of their brother Yosef. They don't know that. They don't know that after they're released from prison after 3 days either. What changed? Next, the Midrash gives the example of Yonah. Yonah's in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights. From this you learn that the Jewish people are never going to be in sorrows for more than 3 days. Yonah's one individual. Right? At least with Avram and Yitzchak, you can say the destiny of Yitzchak is at stake. With Yosef and the brothers, you say the destiny of the Jewish people is at stake. Yonah is one individual, a Navi granted. And the reason why he's in this issue is because he's running away, so to speak, from Hashem, who's telling him what he's supposed to do, who to send him to Nineveh. And Yonah's not interested for whatever reason. And finally, last question on this Midrash. The Midrash says, when it comes to Megillat Esther, Gam Hanes Hazeh, this miracle of the saving of the Jews happens after 3 days. Really? After 3 days? What happened after 3 days in the story of Purim? Nothing! I mean, not nothing, but the Jews aren't saved. Esther goes to the king, and the king doesn't kill her. No, Baruch Hashem. What does the king do? The king asks her, what do you want? I'm Seder. So what does she want? She says, come to a party. They come to a party. He asks her what you want at the party. She says, come back tomorrow for another party. They go back the next day for another party. What happens? She tells the king Haman wants to kill her. Haman gets killed. Okay, but the Jews aren't saved. They have to wait till the 23rd day of Sivan, approximately 3 months later, where the Jews are given permission to defend themselves, still not saved. Only 11 months later, on the 13th day of Adar, the Jews gather together, defend themselves, take revenge against their enemies. Now they're saved. That's 11 months, not 3 days. And besides, the whole thing is difficult to understand here. The fact that Esther goes to the king on the 3rd day was Esther's idea. She's the one who said, I'll go to the king, but first you have to fast for me for 3 days. And I'm going to fast too. So from here you learn, because Esther decided to give a 3-day fast. The whole thing seems difficult to understand. What Bechlal does the Midrash mean? The Jews don't suffer for more than 3 days. Difficult to understand. The Jews have suffered for thousands of years. What do we see from Avram Avinu? Nothing changes when he finds the place. What do we see from the Shvatim? They're either never in danger, or if they think they're in danger, they still think they're in danger when they're released. What do we see from Yonah who's running away? What do we see from Esther, where the whole 3-day thing was her idea, only before she went to the king? And once she went to the king, all that happened is that the king doesn't kill her, but the Jews are still in danger. And yet somehow, seemingly miraculously, amazingly, from this we learn that the Jews are never in tzara. Okay. I want to try to answer some of the questions, Be'ezras Hashem. In order to do so, on 3 introductory ideas or 3 introductory points. Number 1. Again, the Midrash insists that the Jews don't ever suffer for more than 3 days. The first place we see this, says the Midrash, is Avraham Avinu. Because when Hashem sent him to the Akedah with his son Yitzchak, but it says that Avraham Avinu traveled for 3 days. On the 3rd day, he lifts up his eyes and he sees the place where he's supposed to go. All right, introduction number 1. There's a Rashi on the words Bayoim Hashlishi in Chumash Bereishis. Quote, Bayoim Hashlishi, listen to me very carefully. Listen to me very carefully. Listen with your head and your heart. Bayoim Ashlishi sagt Rashi on the third day, Lomo Eichar Milahar Oisei Miyad. Why, says Rashi? Why did the Rabbeinu Shalom not show Avram Avinu the place immediately? Apparently, it wasn't really a 3-day journey. For 3 days, Avram Avinu was just making a kofis, not knowing where to go, because the Rabbeinu Shalom told him, take your son, al-Achad, on one of the mountains that I'm going to tell you. But Hashem doesn't tell him for 3 days. So for 3 days, he's just going traveling around. Why, says Rashi? Loma eichar milar. Why didn't he just show it to him immediately? Very famous Rashi. Kedei shelo yoimru, says Rashi, I'll tell you why. In order so people should not say, Hamomoi v'irbevoi pisaim v'toraf daitoi. The Rabbeinu Shalom confused him. And Avraham Avinu, when he was told by Hashem to sacrifice his son Yitzchak, the son who was born to him at 100 years of age, his son, his only son, the one he loved, Yitzchak, one day the Rabbeinu Shalom came to him and told him, at least Avraham Avinu thought Hashem told him to slit his throat and kill him, Rahman al-Islam. Avraham Avinu lost his mind. Of course Avraham Avinu ran out and went to fulfill what it is that Hashem said. You call that passing a test? It's not passing a test. Temporary insanity. The Rabbeinu Shalom, says Rashi, was concerned that people who will read the story of the Akedah will say, Avraham Avinu passed the test. Avraham Avinu didn't know who he was. He didn't know what time of day it was. He lost his mind. Don't forget, according to Rashi, at this stage he's 137 years old. No? The Rabbeinu Shalom confused him. It was sudden. He didn't know what he was. V'toraf Taitan, he lost his mind. He went out of his mind. Avraham Avinu would have just had time. If Avraham Avinu just had just a little bit of time to process what it is that's going on, that Rabbeinu Shalom is asking him to shecht his son, Rahman al-Islam, he would have never done it. End of Rashi. Again, the Rabbeinu Shalom is concerned that people who will read the story of the Akedah will not be impressed. They'll say Avraham Avinu wasn't really willing to shecht his son. He's just lost his mind. Were he to have had time to process intellectually and emotionally what Hashem told him, he would never do it. Therefore, says Rashi, this answers the question. Therefore, says Rashi, the Rabbeinu Shalom made Avraham Avinu go round and round aimlessly for 3 days. Because after 3 days, this argument no longer holds water. Nobody's going to say that Avraham Avinu was temporarily insane for 3 days. Apparently, according to Rashi, maybe you can try this in the court of law. According to Rashi, even temporary insanity has an expiration date. How long? 3 days. After 3 days, Bayoim Ashlishi, after 3 days, the temporary insanity ends. Avraham Avinu had enough time, quote, L'himolech el liboy. He had enough time to consider in his heart what it is that he was doing. And he did it anyways. At least he was prepared to do it anyways. This proves beyond a shadow of a doubt Avraham Avinu's loyalty and mesirus nefesh to fulfill the word of Hashem. Okay. That's introduction number 1. Again, the point here is, the idea Rashi is communicating, that in order for a person to process something that initially would be completely out of their world, that would rattle them to the core of their being, in order to begin to process this intellectually and emotionally, to begin to digest it, takes a minimum of 3 days. All right. Introduction number 2. In one of his holy sichos, the Lubavitcher Rebbe takes this idea to the next level. He said, the Rebbe explains that this idea that it takes 3 days to process something that is sort of out of your world, that is completely shocking initially. 3 days is the amount of time it takes to begin to inculcate this and process this. Says the Rebbe, this explains a very interesting mitzvah that the Jews were given. Before they left Mitzrayim, they were told by the Rabbeinu Shalom to take the animal that was going to be used as a Korban Pesach, to take it into their homes, all right, to tie it to the bedpost, but be as it may, to take it into their homes 4 days before they left Mitzrayim. 4 days before they shechted it. They took it on the 10th, they slaughtered it on the 14th. Why? The Possuk doesn't give a reason. Says the Rebbe, this is the reason. This is the reason. They're being told to take the Avodah Zarah of Mitzrayim, shecht it, as a korban to Hashem, smear its blood on the doorposts of their home, and leave Mitzrayim the next day as free men. So they got to go from slaves to free men. They got to go from Mitzrayim, who worships this animal, to serving Hashem that takes this animal as a korban. Says the Rebbe, it's the same problem. There's an element to this which is psychologically and mentally and emotionally shocking. So the Jews need time. How much time? 3 full days. All right, there's a discussion here about 3 days and 4 days. I don't want to get into that now. Let's just stick with this idea. The Possuk uses the expression by Avraham Avinu, by Yom HaShlishi, let's call it 3 days. 3 full days, and anyhow. They needed 3 full days. Says the Rebbe, that's the reason why the animal sat tied to their bed for 3 days. They examined it to see if it had any blemishes. It takes 3 full days to examine an animal to see if it has any blemishes. You look at the feet, you look at the hind, you look at the front, 5 minutes, 10 minutes. What's it take 3 days? A simen, says the Rebbe, an indication of a gewisse Sach on a certain thing, aziz geton geworden mit yishuv hadas, that the person is doing this with yishuv hadas means with a settled mind. They know what they're doing. They're present. They've began to internalize. They began to take in. They began to process this shocking new reality of theirs. Is erst wenn mevart. You have to wait. Fear tag, the Rebbe says 4 days or 3 full days, like he gets into as we learn from Avraham Avinu by Yom HaShlishi. Okay, that's introduction number 2. Introduction number 3, also from one of the Sichos of the Rebbe. The Rebbe asks the question. The Rebbe asks the question in great detail. I don't want to get into too many details. I just want to stick to the point. The Midrash says, everybody knows this Midrash, it's very famous, that as soon as Haman issued his decree, Mordechai found 3 children, and he asked them, what are they learning? And one said, Al tirim b'harapisaim, don't be afraid. And the second one says, Utzu eitz v'sufar, when the evil people in the Rishonim make plans, the Rabban Shalom cancels it. And the third one says, Vadzikna anihu, the Rabban Shalom reassures every Yid, I'll be with you till your old age, I'll carry you, I'll bear you, I'll tolerate you. You got nothing to worry about. When Mordechai heard these 3 psukim from these 3 children, he laughed and he celebrated, and he was b'simcha gedolah. And Haman chased him and wanted to know what was going on. And when Haman heard, he swore to kill the children first. Everybody knows the Midrash. So the Rebbe asks a simple question. The Rebbe says, 1 second. But the Midrash says that this story with Mordechai and the 3 children happened immediately upon the release of the letters, immediately upon the release of Haman's decree. Mordechai laughed and rejoiced, and he was, quote, the lashon of the Midrash is, B'simcha gedolah, great simcha. Says the Rebbe, but right after that, the Possuk says that Mordechai went out into the city of Shushan, and Vayilbash sak v'efer, he wore sackcloth and ashes, and he went out in the city of Shushan, and he cried, and we read this Possuk in the tune of Eicha, Z'yaka gedolah umora, a loud and bitter, gut-wrenching cry. Frek the Rebbe favos, what are you crying about? What are you crying about, Frek the Rebbe? You just heard the 3 children say the psukim, and you yourself, Mordechai, just laughed and celebrated b'simcha gedolah. And now he's running around in the street crying with torn clothing, sackcloth, and ashes. For what? And here again I have to read just a couple of lines from the Sikha. The Rebbe says inherently it was a bit of a show. It was a bit of a show. It was, says the Rebbe, not for Mordechai, not because Mordechai himself was truly concerned. At this stage, says the Rebbe, der gewusst Mordechai knew, as Yidden wollen beistehen dem Nisoyen, that the Jewish people will pass the test. Und wollen sein great of Mesiras Nefesh, and the Jews will be ready to have Mesiras Nefesh. And therefore, Sochak, therefore he laughed, and was tremendously rejoicing. So why is he doing it? Quote, Kedei zu me'oyer sein und arois bringen begiloi die nekudas hayadus und the greatkeit of Mesiras Nefesh bepoyel by Yidden. It wasn't for Mordechai's sake, it was for the Jews' sake. Mordechai didn't go out into the streets and say, hey Jews, you got nothing to worry about. Hey Jews, nothing will happen with Haman's decree. Hey Jews, everybody is safe, everything is fine. He didn't do that. You know why? Because Mordechai understood that the gzeira, the purpose of the decree, was to arouse the Jews to have Mesiras Nefesh. He knew that this was an opportunity for them, that the purpose of this was to wake up the Nekudas Hayadus, the Pintel Yid that lies deep hidden in the guts of every Yid. So Mordechai knew that he had to keep up the pretense, to fake it, so to speak, to pretend that the Jewish people really were in danger, because apparently this facade of danger for danger is necessary to arouse the Jews to do tshuva. So Mordechai goes along with it. He cries and he wears torn clothes. It's not because Mordechai thinks the fate of the Jews is the fate of the Jews is at stake. He knows it's not. It's only because the Jews have to be aroused with Mesiras Nefesh. In order to be aroused with Mesiras Nefesh, the Jewish people have to think that they really are in danger. That arouses the Mesiras Nefesh of the Yid. So Mordechai goes along with it. But at the same time, Mordechai already knows that it's going to end well. He's been told by the three children, who told him, Altim pachapisaim, utzaveitza v'sufar, vadzikna anihu. So again, these are the three introductions. Number one, Avraham Avinu needed 3 days. It was Hashem delayed Avraham Avinu by the Akedah 3 days to give time so that we could prove beyond any reasonable doubt that Avraham wasn't in a state of temporary insanity. Number two, the Rebbe says, we find this by Pesach Mitzrayim as well. They also needed to wait this amount of time before they left Mitzrayim so that they could begin to process psychologically, mentally, and emotionally the concept of Yetzias Mitzrayim. And number three, this idea that the Rebbe says that the fate of the Jews isn't really in danger in the days of Purim. Mordechai already knows that. He's heard that from the three children. He's walking around in the streets crying and tearing his clothing and wearing sackcloth and ashes in order to arouse the Jews to do teshuvah. Okay. Parenthetically, by the way, this idea that the Rebbe is saying here, that on Mordechai's end it was sort of a show, it was a pretense. In other words, he was just doing it to arouse the Jews to do teshuvah. This idea is actually a beferish Gemara. Beferish. The Gemara says in Megillah that the sin the Jewish people had committed, that warranted that they should have this decree of Haman on them in the first place, is that they bowed down to the idol of Nebuchadnezzar. This was committed by all the Jews, except for Daniel, Hanani, Mishael, and Azariah, all the Jews, and therefore they were all sentenced to death. So the Gemara asks us in Megillah. The Gemara says, if that's the case, why were the Jews saved? The punishment for Avodah Zarah actually is capital punishment. A question of the Gei Fashtei. This is the Gemara's question. If that's the case, says the Gemara, why were the Jews saved? If they violated and they bowed down to Avodah Zarah, then they deserve to die. Says the Gemara, no, you don't understand. The Jewish people didn't actually worship the idol of Nebuchadnezzar. They just pretended. They knew if they didn't bow down, Nebuchadnezzar would kill them. So they bowed down for a pretense. They pretended. So the Rebbeinu Shalom in the days of Haman pretended to sentence them to death. They were never really in danger, but they needed to do tshuva. The Jews sinned by pretending to bow down to Avodah Zarah. The Kadosh Baruch Hu responded, Mida Keneged Mida, by pretending to sentence them to death. They weren't really in danger, just like they never really worshipped the Avodah Zarah, but they needed to do tshuva, and so they did. It's the same idea that the Rebbe is saying over here. The Mordechai knew the Jews would be saved, but he went around the sackcloth and ashes so that the Jews should feel like they're in danger. This would be sufficient to arouse their koyach hamasiras nefesh. Okay. Based on this, I want to go back and answer all the questions one at a time. Number one. The Midrash says, quote, Ein Yisrael nesunim batzora yoyser mekimol yomim. The Jews are never going to be in danger for more than 3 days. Now, what in heaven's name does that mean? Again, the Jewish people have suffered for thousands of years. I don't believe the Midrash is referring to physical suffering. I don't believe the Midrash chas v'sholem intends to be dismissive of the suffering of the Jews over months, sometimes years, sometimes decades, sometimes centuries. God forbid. The Midrash is talking about something specific and unique that never lasts for more than 3 days. What is it? Not the Jewish people's physical suffering. We're talking about their spiritual suffering. And what type of spiritual suffering? We're talking about a Jew who's spiritually, so to speak, in Mitzrayim, and needs to realize that he or she is not a slave, is not an eved. He or she needs to realize that they're a free person, that they belong to the nation of Hashem. We're talking about a Jew who's spiritually lost. They've forgotten who they are. Their sense of identity is gone. That sorrow, says the Midrash, that sorrow of a Jew who's lost their sense of identity, who's lost their compass and doesn't know where it is that they're going, that sorrow never lasts more than 3 days. And here I want to double down on what I think is the point. Lahavdil, in the world of psychology, they say, if a person has a sense within themselves that they're going through a particular difficulty for a reason, whatever the reason may be, you can survive you can survive. Viktor Frankl said very famously, right? I don't want to quote him because I'm afraid I might misquote, but the idea is that he said, a person can survive and bear tremendous amounts of yisurim, of pain and suffering, if in their minds there's a destination point, if they can see a reason, something to survive for, if they know they're on their way to something, and it's part of a journey, then lo yaleinu Rahman l'Islam, if a person has to, for whatever God-known reason, go through something, they can survive it. Because there's a light at the end of the tunnel. They see where they're going. Again, why does the Eibishter have to make it this way? We'll never know. Hashem could have made it differently, 100%. We're not trying to give an answer or an explanation for it. What we're trying to say is, if a person sees that all of this is for some type of purpose, if they can draw a line from what it is that they're going through to the destination, to the purpose of it, then a person can go through a tremendous amount if they see some reason, purpose for it. The tzoros Rahman al sets in. The real trouble begins when a person doesn't see the light at the end of the tunnel. We forget what it is that this is even really all about. That, says the Midrash, if a Jew taka loses themselves, not just the Jew finds themselves Rahman al in Golus, or even the Golus of Achashverosh, in which case the Jewish people were sentenced to death. If a Jew loses their sense of identity, you know that expression of the Gemara, Ein simcha ka'toras asfekes. There's no joy like the removal of doubt. Right? This is, on the surface, very difficult thing to understand. What if you find out for sure that, there's something terrible is about to happen? Rahman al-Islam. Now you know for sure. Ein simcha ka'toras asfekes. Now you have no doubt. It means, Ein simcha ka'toras asfekes means there's no joy like a person having true internal discovery. La'olam ein yisrol nesunin batzora yoysim megimel yomim, says the Midrash with me very carefully. If a Jew gets lost, if a Jew doesn't remember who they are and what it is that they're all about, and they've gotten lost in they're sitting at the meal of Achashverosh and they're enjoying it. They've forgotten who they are. Make no mistake, says the Midrash. A Jew is on a spiritual leash. How long does it last? 3 days, never more. Never more. Once the decree of Achashverosh sets in, once the decree of Haman sets in, the Jews are going to remind themselves very quickly who they are. How long is it going to take? 3 days. I say, how long does it take? 3 days? It takes 1 second. Right? The moment of Mesiras Nefesh takes 1 second. Yes, says the Midrash. But look what happened by Avraham Avinu. Where do we learn this from Avraham Avinu? What happened? Hashem made Avraham Avinu wait for 3 days. Why? Because 3 days is the amount of time that it takes, says Rashi, to psychologically, mentally, and emotionally process what it is that's going on. No more. A Jew doesn't suffer with a loss of a sense of identity for more than 3 days. What happens after 3 days? After 3 days, the Jew has time to process within themselves, to remember who it is that they are. And then once they know who they are, like Avraham Avinu, after 3 days it took to convince everybody, right, that he was doing this b'yishuv hadas, with the presence of mind, not that he was in a state of confusion. After 3 days, a Jew emerges with crystal clarity. Crystal clarity. Crystal clarity. It's so clear, even the rest of the world will know this, right? That's what Rashi is saying. If Avraham Avinu had done it immediately, the rest of the world wouldn't know. It took him 3 days. Now Avraham Avinu's crystal clarity spreads out through the world. Avraham Avinu knows it, and the rest of the world knows it. After 3 days, when Avraham Avinu arrived at the place of the Akedah, he had time to process within himself that he was doing this b'mesiras nefesh, al kiddush Hashem, because Hashem had instructed him to do so. He was in peace with it internally, psychologically, emotionally, mentally. He was there. And the rest of the world knew it. Says the Midrash, you know where else you see this? So this answers question number 1. What does the Midrash mean? Ein yisol and sunim b'torah. The Jewish people don't suffer for more than 3 days. It means suffering with a sense of a loss of identity. It takes 3 days because that's how long it takes. Once the discovery is made, once the neshama wakes up, it takes 3 days to inculcate that, to allow that to process and digest in the system of the person. That's why the Midrash brings the example of Avraham Avinu, because as the Rashi, the Midrash says, Rashi quotes it from the Midrash. The Midrash says that these 3 days were necessary for Avraham Avinu to process it within himself, so everybody would know that this is something that Avraham Avinu did with a clear presence of mind, not in a moment of being swept off his feet and not thinking rationally. Okay. Next, says the Midrash, I'll give you another proof that I'm right, that the process of tshuva takes 3 days. What's the proof? Yosef locks up the brothers for 3 days. No. So what is that proof? Yosef locks up the brothers for 3 days. So you know what you got to do? You got to open a chumash. Yosef locks up the brothers for 3 days. Parshas Miketz. What is it? Perek Mem Beis. Possuk Yud Zayin. Yosef locks the brothers up for 3 days, and then by Yom HaShlishi, what happened on the 3rd day? Yosef released his brothers. He tells them, all right, if you're telling the truth, only one brother will stay here, and the rest of you go home, bring home food, and bring your younger brother, bring Binyamin back. What does the Possuk say next? As soon as the brothers were released from this 3-day imprisonment, and one man said to his brother, we are responsible for what we did to our brothers. We saw him in pain. We saw him suffering. He was pleading with us. We didn't listen. Therefore say the brothers, therefore all of this is happening. Wow! Discovery! The brothers are doing tshuva for selling Yosef into slavery. Of course, they don't know that they're having this conversation in front of Yosef, right? They don't know. But they are, and for the first time in 22 years, we read that the brothers do tshuva for what they did. What did it take for them to do tshuva, says the Midrash? 3 days. As soon as they were put into prison, all it took was 3 days. And then the tshuva was pulsating in every fiber of their being. They were ready to confess. They were ready to confess openly. They were ready to take responsibility and say, Al Kain, boy, this is why everything is happening. We're at fault. Now the tshuva was complete. Now they were ready to be reunited. Next example says the Midrash Yoina. Yoina is in the belly of the fish. Again, the same thing. What happens after Yoina is in the belly of the fish 3 days and 3 nights? The next Possuk says, Vayispalel Yoina Lashem. After fleeing and fleeing and fleeing, Yoina was finally locked up for 3 days. Vayispalel Yoina. The tshuva part begins. And Yoina begins to daven to Hashem. Yoina begins to daven to Hashem from the belly of the fish and tell the Rabbeinu Shalom, please, I'm ready to do tshuva, save me. It never takes, once a Jew realizes, once it comes the time for a Jew to do tshuva, once it comes the time for the spiritual darkness to end, says the Midrash, it never takes more than 3 days. Okay. Let's go back to the conversation of Mordechai and Esther where we started. Mordechai comes to Esther one day and says to her, Excuse me. Mordechai comes to Esther one day and says to her, go to the king. Go to the king immediately. Save the Jews. She says, whoa, I haven't been summoned. If I show up and announce them, I'm going to die. Mordechai says, what do you think? Almighty God is going to abandon the Jews? B'kol makom, he says, ma'amid lahem goyel. Whether you go or whether you don't go, the Rabbeinu Shalom is going to bring them a redeemer. You notice the Midrash is using the word goyel, a redeemer. It doesn't say Hashem is going to bring the Jews, somebody who was going to save them, somebody who was going to destroy Haman, somebody who was going to destroy Achashverosh, somebody who's got nothing. Goyel, a redeemer. What's the significance of saying you're redeeming something? Redeeming is not recreating. Redeeming. Mordechai doesn't say the Rabban Shalom is going to wipe out the nations of the world who are the Hamans. The Rabban Shalom will, but that's not the point. B'kol makom ma'amid lahem goyel, says Mordechai. The Rabban Shalom is going to redeem the Jews. We're going to find that pintel yid, that nekudas hayadus, that little place deep inside the Jew that's in Golus, and we're going to extract it. We're going to pull it out. We're going to remind the Jew who they are, the Jews who've gotten lost, the Jews who are sitting at the meal of Achashverosh and enjoying it. Says Mordechai HaKadosh Baruch Hu ma'amid lahem goyel. The Rabban Shalom is going to sound the alarm and redeem the Jews. Okay, says Esther. Time to redeem the Jews? No problem. But we need 3 days. We need 3 days. Why do we need 3 days? Because 3 days is the amount of time it takes for Yishuv Das. The Jewish people have to do tshuva. They have to think that they are in danger. They have to think that their life is at stake. And for 3 days, they have to do tshuva to allow this Mesiras Nefesh to saturate in their beings, to express itself in the Rebbe's words, in their machshava dibra ma'is, in every fiber of their being. We have to wait 3 days. Mordechai says, but the Jewish people are in danger now. Yes, says Esther. But you don't just want to kill Haman. You don't just want to destroy the enemies. You want to redeem the Jews. That means you want to find a place of sanctity and holiness and freedom that's buried deep inside the Yid, and you want to extract it and celebrate it and redeem it. Yes, says Esther, that's what you want to do. Gather the Jews in the capital city who would obviously represent the Jews of the whole world, and let them fast, and let them do tshuva. Let them daven to the Eibishter to save them for 3 days. Let them realize they've gotten lost, and then let them do tshuva. I had a teacher, one of my mashpim, he gave me a fantastic analogy for this idea. He said, we know that when a person is loyalenu in physical danger, right? The person is in a car accident, may Hashem protect us, a burning building, God knows what. So we know that the adrenaline kicks in, and a person can lift things and jump and run and hide in places that under normal circumstances is completely impossible, right? You go back later to the crime of the scene. How did people emerge from this burning building? How did they get out of the car? How did they lift beams and heavy objects? Crawl into places, crawl out of places. Difficult to understand. At the time the adrenaline is pumping, it's pumping. So he said like this. He said, imagine a person is trapped, Rahman al-Islam, a burning building, whatever the case may be, right? And the only way to save themselves is to jump, and the only way you can do this to jump is with the adrenaline. So imagine the person stands there and goes, you know something? I'm not afraid of the burning building. Why? Because I know the adrenaline will kick in, and I'll be able to jump, and I'll save myself. So what happens is, if you're counting on the power of adrenaline kicking in and saving you, then you don't think you're in danger. If you don't think you're in danger, then the adrenaline doesn't kick in. You have to truly believe that you're taka in danger. You have to truly think that this is Rahman al-Islam, the end. Then you're prepared to do whatever it takes to save yourself. The adrenaline kicks in, and then you're saved. Right? It's like, a person says, I'll sin and then do tshuva. It doesn't work. You have to actually think that this is the end of you, even though it's not. And then the adrenaline is released, and then you can save yourself. It's the same kind of idea over here. The Mordechai says, the Jews are not in danger, they'll be saved. The Rabban Shalom will redeem them. Esther says, yes, the Rabban Shalom will redeem them, but it's going to take 3 days for the Jewish people to be redeemed, meaning for their neshama to be released within themselves. They have to live in this danger for 3 days. Mordechai says, but the 3 days include Pesach. We're going to fast on Pesach? Again, from Mordechai's perspective, there is no danger. Not just the reality is, not just Mordechai's perspective. There is no danger here at all. How can we fast on Pesach? Remember the words of Esther? She says, Zoken shebi Yisrael, lomahu Pesach. What does she mean, Zoken shebi Yisrael, lomahu Pesach? The Meforshim say she means if the Jewish people are destroyed, there won't be a Pesach. There won't be anybody to celebrate Pesach. I think we're reading the commentary of this explanation of the commentaries superficially. We got to go much deeper. Because then why doesn't she just say that? Because it doesn't say that. Lomahu Pesach. She means to say what is Pesach. Why do we celebrate? Why do we celebrate Pesach? Because Hashem took us out of Mitzrayim. No. She says, remember. When the Jewish people left Mitzrayim, in order to leave Mitzrayim, they needed to tie the animal and keep it in their home, tie it to their bedposts for 3 days. They needed time to process within themselves that they were free people. Otherwise, they weren't ready to go out of Mitzrayim. You can't just free the Jew. You got to give him 3 days to process it. Esther says to Mordechai, can't just, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ma'amad Lehem Goyel. Okay, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Ma'amad Lehem Goyel, but look what happened by Pesach. Look what happened in the story of Yetzias Mitzrayim. You still needed 3 days to process it, to inculcate it. The Jews need 3 days. And I love that she calls him Zoken Shebi Yisrael. What's Zoken Shebi Yisrael? Zoken Shebi Yisrael means he's the Nasi Ador, he's the leader of the generation. Esther tells Mordechai, as the leader of the generation, it's not enough that from your perspective, you see the Jews are already going to be free for sure. You have to be able to see it from the Jews' perspective. The Jews need 3 days to process this. They need to, so to speak, live in this danger so that the tshuva is complete. Says the Midrash, as soon as Mordechai heard this, miyad shoma Mordechai heard what she was saying. He admitted that she was right. Yes, again, in other words, in Mordechai's world, Mordechai already heard the Jewish people, the children saying, Al Tirim Pachad Pisam. Mordechai already celebrated. Mordechai already laughed and was B'simcha G'dayla. He sees the salvation of the Jews. Esther says to him, yes, but the Jews need time. The Jews need at least 3 days. Why 3 days? And you saw the son of Batzara, you see from Avraham Avinu and from the Shvatim and from Yoina and from Tchias HaMesim and from Esther herself. You see that it takes 3 days. She says, give us 3 days to fast. Lomahu Pesach. What is Pesach? What's the content of Pesach? The content of Pesach is not just that the Jews leave Mitzrayim, but they have 3 days. 3 or 4, without not getting stuck on that. To process this, you need to give this time to the Jewish people as well. I too, says Esther, and my maidservants, we're also going to fast, and then we're going to go to the king. We're going to go to the king after we have fasted and done tshuva and allowed ourselves to process this reality, the tshuva reality, the new mind frame of the Jews. And then, of course, as soon as we go to the king, everything will be saved. I believe that this idea is uniquely connected to this year. Why? This year, Tafshin Pei 2025, this year Purim is Friday. Purim is Friday. Shushan Purim is Shabbos. From Shabbos, many of the halachas of Purim get pushed off to Sunday. What do they call this year? Purim Meshulish. What's Purim Meshulish? A 3-day Purim. Friday is Purim for the non-walled cities. Shabbos is Purim for the walled cities. And Sunday is Purim because those walled cities that have Purim on Shabbos, it gets pushed off to Sunday, right? The Gemara says you don't read the Megillat on Shabbos, etc. So here the Rabban Shalom has given us, so to speak, a 3-day Purim. Why do you need 3 days for Purim? Ein Yisrael nesunim b'tzara yosem b'gimel yomim, because the Jewish people the tzaras never lasts for more than 3 days. 3 days is how long it takes to process this. May Hashem help us that this year, as we have Taka, 3-day Purim, we should celebrate all 3 days. We should remember that the tzaras of the Yidden is, Rahman, may Hashem protect us, is temporary. We're supposed to be able to focus clearly and never forget Ki imonu keil, that Hashem is with us, HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzileinu miyodam. The Eibishter saved us and continues to save us. We are truly, truly beyond nature. As we celebrate this year, the 3-day Purim, may Hashem help us that it be Zichram lo Yosef Mizara, may it be truly the final victory over the Hamans and the Sinwars and the Hezbollahs and all of Kol Soina Yisrael. May they end up hanging in the gallows as Haman did in his 10 sons. And for the Jewish people, may there be Oira, V'simcha, V'sosen, V'kor. Amen. Kein Tia Lonu. Afreilich in Purim.